Greetings and welcome to Chapter 7 Voting and Elections. So, when we think of politics, right, we often think about voter turnout. We think of the outcome of an election. We might even think of different types of elections, and we ought to. So, today we're going to be looking at voter reforms, where we've been, where we currently at today. We're going to be looking at types of elections, some terminology, what impacts voter turnout, and the Electoral College. So with that said, let's begin. Let's dive into this. So residents are required to register to vote prior to casting said vote. So there's a registration requirement, and for the most part, it's actually relatively easy to do this. Now, of course, states get to determine a little bit of states get to determine the registration process. Is it online, completely online? Is it do you have to do it 30 days prior to the election, like we have it here in Texas? Other states have it where you can register to vote the same day as the election. So states get to have a say in the voter registration process. But when we speak of this registration process, we're talking about basically a residency requirement, right? That the stipulation that any citizen, must live in a state for a determined period of time before a citizen can register to vote as a resident of that state. So these residency requirements, if we think it through, these help with voter fraud. It helps to protect against voter fraud. Why? Because now, I can't live in Texas and then go, oh, well, I've lived in Louisiana for a day, so I should be counted as a resident of Louisiana. Well, no, not quite, right? We now true, Louisiana might have some different stipulations about how Louisiana law works, but this helps with this idea that you have to get registered and that there is a residency requirement. This does help to deter voter fraud. There are some requirements that are established at the state level, and then there are some registration requirements that are established at the federal level. So we are looking here at the requirements for Texas, specifically for Texas, right? You have to be a U.S. citizen. You have to be a resident of the county for 30 days, even if you've already been a resident of the state. So if you move between counties, like when I moved in 2016 from Hunt. I have to think about this from Hunt County down here in Harris County. When I made that move, I had to wait 30 days living in Harris County before I could register to vote. Again, this is a requirement established by the state. Must be 18 years old. That is established by the federal government. 18 years of age, that is done at the federal level. The state cannot change that. The state cannot somehow determine, or a county for that matter, they cannot change, well, we think the voting age should be 21. 18-year-olds are too immature, or we should increase it to 25 or to 30. That cannot happen. That is established at the federal level. So just note that. Cannot be a convicted felon. Again, some states have a little bit of leeway when it comes to that particular issue. Some states allow felons to vote. Other states do not, like Texas. There's also a little more. There's also a little bit of not confusion is not the word I want to use, but there's a little bit of confusion that if you are a convicted felon, now assuming that you are not serving any parole, that you're not serving any probation, you're not serving any jail time, you are literally, you're out, right, completely. And you're not serving any punishment whatsoever. Assuming that's the case, you do regain your right to vote. But if you are a felon, currently serving probation, currently serving any type of parole or jail time, uh, your right to vote has been forfeited, right? So just note that. In order to vote here in the great state of Texas, you must have a state-issued photo ID. Photo ID laws, they can be. There's an argument, right? There's an argument about how effective they are and how are they a barrier to anyone voting, right? Is it a barrier? Are photo IDs considered a poll tax? Because a ID issued by the state is not free. You have to pay for that. Could the argument is then that photo IDs is in fact a reinstitution of a vote tax. Others say this is a necessary thing. Everyone has a photo ID. We have to present one when we buy alcohol. That we have to have one to work, etc. And that most of us commonly do have a state issue ID on us. So it's not that big of a hindrance, right? And it does protect against voter fraud. So those are the two main arguments. Now, I have one question. Fake IDs do exist. They do. Do photo IDs... I'm curious about the research. How effective photo ID laws and how rampant fake IDs are. I don't know. I know they exist, but are they rampant? Are they used in elections? I think that's a good question. I do not know. I have worked in many elections in my past, many elections, and does voter fraud exist? Yes. On a wide scale to change like a presidential election? No. What you see when there is voter fraud that is committed, it's usually around, between 100 to 300 votes. That's not going to change an outcome of a presidential election. It might change the outcome at a local race where you see most of voter fraud occurring in local races for various reasons. But I'm digressing, I don't mean to. And you also must register to vote at least 30 days prior to an election. Now, that again, these are the requirements for Texas. States have some leeway. States govern most over election requirements, election processes. So the states get to decide most of this. But there are, like I said, voting age that is established at the federal level. Any state cannot change that. Let's move on. National Voter Registration Act, sometimes referred to as the Motor Voter Act. This was enacted to simplify the registration process. Right? It requires states to allow citizens to register to vote when they sign up for the driver's license and Social Security benefits. So there are two basically populations that are aimed at, right? Those who are becoming of age to vote, right? You get your driver's license typically around your 18th birthday. You might get it a little bit before, but you get what I'm saying here. Social Security benefits, those who are retiring, those who are eligible for that. So you got two groups, right, that are kind of aimed at with this piece of legislation. It's interesting to note that. But here in Texas, while the Motor Voter Act is on the books, we have to note that here in Texas, there's only one real effective way to register to vote. If you renewed your driver's license, if you got your driver's license and you recall this, there's a checkbox to say register to vote. Please note, checking that box does nothing. It does not register you to vote. There's essentially only one way to vote. One way to get registered. One way here in the great state of Texas. And that is filling out an application and sending it, physically sending it to the appropriate authorities. That's the way to register to vote here in the great state of Texas. Now, there's a other side where you can have a deputy voter registrar uh, register you to vote, but ultimately, that deputy will get that application from you and then hand deliver it to the appropriate authorities. So ultimately, it's still the same thing, right? Ultimately, you are printing out, you have a physical um, application, you're filling out, and you're physically sending it one way or the other. So ultimately, there's just one way. Ultimately, um, but I'm digressing. So even though this is on the Motor Voter Act is in place, we here in Texas, you still have to register. You still have to fill out an application, and you have to mail it off. Checking that box does not register you to vote. So just keep that in mind. Help America Vote Act, also referred to as HAVA, of 2002, requires states to update voting equipment. So we saw a push after the 2020 presidential election, which was a little bit controversial. It took the U.S. Supreme Court to hear the case Al Gore v. Bush, or is it Bush v. Al Gore? I can't remember which one was first, but I'm digressing again. That presidential election was determined by the U.S. Supreme Court, and after what we saw with particular election equipment in Florida, Congress passed HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, which required updating voting equipment. We saw a push for digital voting, not online voting. I don't like calling it that because we do not have that. But digital voting, right? We are using machines now. Back before HAVA, like when I was voting, my first election was the 2000 presidential election, and when I would go vote, it was with paper. It was a paper ballot. It was a Scantron, actually, and we were starting to, with HAVA, getting those federal funds and those federal resources, we began to embrace digital voting, right? So HAVA helped with that. Help voting more accessible to the disabled. Maintain computerized voter rolls that could be updated regularly. Now, voter rolls are interesting, especially when we talk about the 2016 presidential election. Russia, if we're unfamiliar with what happened in 2016, just a very brief recap. Russia interfered with our election in the 2016 presidential election. And the way that they did that, they didn't change votes. What they did was they went in, they targeted computerized voter rolls and deleted registered voters from that roll. So if you're not registered to vote, you can't vote. So there is some criticism that should be levied against computerizing voter rolls, right? Because that is acceptable. The moment that we computerize anything, that opens up the threshold, right, to be crossed for hacking, for interference. That's illegal, right? But nevertheless, HAVA helped with making voting, keeping up with voter registration rolls. They were trying to help it make it more beneficial, trying to improve the voting process in general. So we're continuing on with this thought, right? That the Interstate Voter Registration Cross-Check Program. This allows states to more easily share voter registration information with each other as a way to prevent, right? Number one, to keep books, because, okay, let me back up. People move, right? Frequently, right? I mean, it seems like we're always perpetually in a state of moving, either to a different state, to another county, whatever the case may be, maybe even down just the road, across the street, whatever the case may be, right? there's a reason why U-Haul is still in business. Right? I'm digressing. Point I'm trying to get at is people move. And this program allowed us to share, allowed states to share voter information to ensure the integrity of the voter roll, to ensure that there's no duplicates, to make sure that those the purpose is to identify voters who have moved from one state to another. So that way that the voter roll can be updated with the appropriate information that this voter is not here in this state anymore. They reside in a different state. They can register to vote in that one. Right? So this program its aim was to assist states and also to prevent voter fraud. It uses a matching algorithm that analyzes the combined data from all participating states and finds duplicate first name, last name, and date of birth between the states. So that's how it works. It uses an algorithm to use first name, last name, and date of birth. So where we are today. I know I said it already, but I need to recap this and make sure we understand this properly. That remember that states mostly manage voting rights. Mostly. Now, the age, that's established by the federal government. But in terms of voter registration requirements, again, established by the states. How elections are to be conducted, that's up to the states. What equipment we use, that's actually up to the county. Hold up. County clerk. I blacked out there for a second. it just left my mind. The county clerk gets to decide. Now the Secretary of State comes up with like different methods that are appropriate for the Secretary of State for the state. Let me back up. Let me back up. I'm getting too excited about talking about elections. So each state has a Secretary of State that is over the records and voting of the entire state. So for Texas, we have a Texas Secretary of State which handles this. They come up with a list. They draft up a list of approved voting mechanisms to record our votes, and then it's up to the counties to choose which method they want to use. Right. So I've said all this to get to this main point. States mostly manage voting rights. Mostly. Some have adopted restrictions, more restrictions on voting, like Texas, Arizona, Florida. Others expand access to it. Louisiana, Colorado, Maine. So some examples we could look at is Texas Senate Bill 1, which establishes new ID requirements for people voting by mail and gives voters new opportunities to correct mistakes with their mail ballots. It also creates new criminal penalties for people who assist voters at the polls, bans drive-through voting, and extended voting hours, and it empowers partisan poll watchers. And this last part is really problematic. And the reason why I say that is regardless if you're a Democrat, regardless if you're a Republican, independent, regardless of where you are, regardless of where you stand on political issues, a poll watcher who is allowed to, a poll watcher is someone who usually it's a volunteer from one of the major political parties, if not both. Usually you have both Republican and Democrat poll watchers. Their task is to just literally do as it says, just watch over the process, make sure it's open and fair, and make sure that nothing illegal is happening, make sure everything is on the up and up. But what this does, though, what this SB1, Texas SB1 does, what it does is it empowers partisan poll watchers to have more authority. And that's a little problematic. If I'm a Democrat, I don't want an aggressive Republican poll watcher in trying to intimidate me, and vice versa. I don't want to be a Republican with a Democrat poll watcher watching over me and then trying to intimidate me. So I don't like that part of it, to be honest, if I were to be straight up with you. And it has nothing to do with party identification. It has everything to do with I don't like the idea of a partisan poll watcher using intimidation. And that's it's a fear I have that that's what might happen. We'll see though. That said, Colorado, if we compare that to Colorado on the other hand, they passed a law that allows some voters, that is Colorado House Bill 22, they passed this that allows some voters with disabilities to return their ballots electronically. Right? So we have some differences. Right? We see some states trying to clamp down and trying to add more restrictions. And then we see other states loosening those restrictions or making it more accessible. So how we view that kind of comes down to our ideology, to be honest with you. Some don't, of course. Like I said, partisan poll watchers, the fact that they are more empowered may be troubling to some of us, regardless of where we stand on the political spectrum. We should all strive for voter integrity, right? We should all have voter fraud should be sought out, it should be investigated, and found, it should be prosecuted. Right? I don't think you hear anyone that says that should not happen. But I find it interesting that it seems like when we talk about laws that are trying to prevent voter fraud, it seems like it's being more and more restrictive to those who are legal, who are trying to vote, who are eligible to vote, who meet the requirements. I don't know. Or is this not that big of a deal? It may not be. I digress. Let's move on now to voter turnout. So, voter turnout. So we have two separate populations here that we should dive into just a little bit. Right? We have the voting age population. That is the number of citizens over 18. So we're talking about U.S. citizens who are 18 and above. Right? And then we have voter eligible population. This is different. This is the number of citizens who are eligible to vote. It's a little bit different, right? Voting age population is simply those U.S. citizens who are 18 and above. Full stop. And then the voting eligible population is the number of citizens actually eligible to vote. They meet all the requirements: age, residency, they register to vote 30 days prior to the election, etc. Right? So, two separate populations. Factors that do affect voter turnout. We got four here that we need to look into. Right? We have income. Turnout increases with higher income. So, studies have shown that the more income someone makes, the more money you bring in, it increases as income rises. Not just the opportunity, but your willingness to actually go vote increases. Voter turnout increases with higher income. So the more money you make, the more likely you are to go vote, is what I'm really trying to get at. Education. Studies have also shown that the more education you receive, the more likely you are to actually go and vote. Again, very similar to income. When you think about education, though, real quick, right? You had to take a government class, right? And you listened to, hopefully, you had the opportunity to be told why voting is important. And before I move on, let me actually address that here and now real fast. Has anyone ever told you why you should vote? Now, sure, we've been told voting is important. Right. But have we been told why? Well, it's the reason why we should vote is because we are giving our consent. Right? This kind of goes back to previous lectures, but in short, we are giving our consent to candidates, to political parties. We're telling them, yes, we agree with your platform. Yes, we agree with your ideas. Yes, we agree with what you are trying to do. Please see it through. We are consenting to the governance over you and I. Now, what we should note is, maybe your candidate didn't win. It happens. Electoral loss does in fact happen, and it stinks. To be honest with you, it stinks. When your candidate, right, it's kind of like your football team, right? If your football team loses, right, it hurts, right? Like, oh man, right? Or your favorite soccer team, or your favorite basketball team, or your favorite baseball team, whatever the case may be. When your team loses, even in a computer game, right, it hurts, right? It just does. So, we should vote. And so if you're saying, well, my candidate didn't win, I didn't consent, well, you can still protest, right? You can list your grievances to the government. Not that your candidate lost necessarily, but because you want to ensure that your voice is heard. Right? So that's usually why we see when we see elections and we see the outcome and we see protests, right? It's our way to list grievances. It's our way to say that, I did not consent to this, right? And it's a way to voice our opinion, and we should. Race and ethnicity. So blacks and whites vote the highest, right? So we see voter turnout among blacks and whites to be highest, while Hispanics and Asians, they vote at the lowest level. And there are various reasons for this, right? Various reasons. And it kind of comes down to one of these reasons we can look at is the idea that if I register to vote, am I endangering my family? And the answer to that is no. The answer is no. When you register to vote, what you have to provide is your name, your address, your driver's license if you have one, your driver's license number, just a number, and then your signature, and that's it. That's all I ask for, if I remember correctly. So I'm saying that because somehow by registering to vote, you're not somehow telling the authorities, your family history. That's not happening. Nothing like that. So what we have here are circumstances, maybe some misunderstandings of the voting process or the registration process, that we see Hispanics and Asians turn out less to vote. Age. Older Americans vote the highest. Yes, those who are older, we go and vote. While 18 to 24-year-olds vote at the lowest level. So the older you are, the more likely you are to go vote. Which brings up an interesting conversation, right? And that is this. Have you ever noticed the laws that are passed by Congress? Have you ever noticed what is being spoken about at the national level? It's issues pertaining to those who vote. Young people, typically, historically, we don't have a high record of voter turnout. We just don't. Sure. Certain elections, like maybe in 2008, maybe again in 2012, we saw more younger voters come out and vote. And that, sure. But one or two elections is not enough. We have to vote consistently over every election. When every election comes up, we have to vote. And if we do that, we'll catch the attention. You'll start seeing laws that are aimed more at the younger population, if you will. Right? If so, another way we can look at this, right, is, and I'm going to borrow this from a voter deputy registrar, because she uses this example that I heard, and I'm going to pass it on to you. Right? Let's hypothetically say, we're in a class, right? We're in a classroom. There's about, let's just say 32 of us, right? And if only those who are, 25 and up, right? If only those vote, and the question on the ballot is, do you want to have a final exam? Yes or no, right? And only those who are 25 and older vote. And hypothetically speaking, let's say that there's only like a small handful of us. Well, then those older adults will dictate what happens, right? Voter turnout is important, and we need to vote consistently. We need to get out and we need to vote in order to catch the attention. And we need to do it consistently, not just one or two elections. It has to be very methodical. So if you ever wonder to yourself, if you ever ask yourself, why isn't things, why is it like the issues that I care about, they're not just being paid, they're just being ignored? Well, does that issue pertain to those who actually do vote historically, consistently, time and time and time again? Rain, hail, wind, hurricanes, flooding, tornadoes, severe weather. Those who are older, we vote. So, yeah, it's interesting. Let's move on. Other factors that influence voter turnout: voter registration and photo ID laws. So if you don't, like here in Texas, if you don't register to vote 30 days prior to an election, you can't vote. If you don't register to vote, and so let's hypothetically say, right, that you remembered, oh man, I got registered to vote, but it's 29 days to the election. Even though you're 1 day late, you're not going to be able to vote. You're just not. Sure, you can go in and get registered, but not for that upcoming election that's about to happen in 29 days. So that restriction of itself can prevent, because we have busy lives. I mean, let's just be honest, right? Some of us were in school. Some of us were working full time and being in school. Some of us are dealing with family. We got so much on our plate. Do we honestly remember to register to vote 30 days prior to an election? Right? So this can be a hindrance to some. Now, I need to note this real quick. If you've already registered and you have not moved, you're good, right? You only have to register once. But the point here, though, is if you do move, even if it's just down the street, across the street, you're in the same county, but you moved within that county, you still have to re-register to vote. And the reason for that is how districts and how precincts are written up, how they are drawn. You might be in a completely different precinct with a completely different set of representatives in government. So we got to be careful about that. Photo IDs, again, I personally know someone who lived their entire life. They unfortunately passed away. They lived their entire life without having a photo ID. They did not have a driver's license. So if we don't have a state issued photo ID, that restriction can prevent you from voting. But I should make a note here: in the great state of Texas, if you don't have a state issue ID, which could be a military ID, it can be your I'm recalling all my elections information here. All the elections I used to work, if you have a government issue ID of any kind, but it has to be from the government, right? Your school issue ID won't suffice. Texas driver's license, your learning license, a military issue ID, your passport, U.S. passport will work. If you don't have that, you can basically sign an affidavit and bring in and the affidavit is basically just your initials and your signature, nothing. And then you present your bank, like a bank statement or a utility bill, and assuming that it matches up with what you're saying, you will be able to vote. I believe it might be provisionally. More on provisional ballots later. So that okay. So voter fatigue, right? So let me go back. Photo IDs. Some may say it's a barrier. For others, this isn't such a big of an issue. But since there's a since there is a population that says that it's a barrier, it's a problem, that can influence voter turnout. Voter fatigue. Simply, we are asked to vote too often. But well, what voter fatigue is a situation when voters grow tired of voting and stay home from the polls from long ballots and frequent elections. No joke. Here in Texas, I want to say it was 2018 election. It's either 2018 or 2016, and they're kind of bleeding together. But we had a 13-page ballot here in Harris County, 13 pages, and we always have an election every 2 years. Every 2 years. Now, sometimes we can have more because we will have a special election. We might have a runoff election during the primary. So there's possible we may actually have to vote or asked to vote more than twice a year. So we are voter fatigue can set in pretty fast here, right? Pretty fast. Yeah, voting is not mandatory in the United States, unlike other countries like Belgium and Turkey. You have to vote. It's mandatory. You are violating the law if you do not vote. I know in Australia they have about like an 98% voter turnout. Why? Because if you don't vote, you're taxed. There is a special tax that is levied against you if you do not vote. Right? So to avoid the tax, people just go and vote. Should that, that's a question for you and I. Should we make voting mandatory? Should we punish those who choose not to vote? Should we follow the Australian method? It's a good question. So, who wins an election? Well, it depends on the type of election, right? We have a majority where a candidate must receive more than half the votes to win the election. This is based on the winner-take-all system. And then we have a plurality, where a candidate wins if a candidate who receives the most votes wins the election, even without a majority. So we have these two types of candidates here, right? It all comes down to what election is being conducted. What election are we looking at? An election, for example, of a plurality, look no further than like the 2006 gubernatorial race here in Texas. A winner takes all. We're gonna be diving more into this, more into electoral college. So I'm gonna save that. I'm gonna put a little pin in that discussion until we get to electoral college. So bear with me. We will get there. So there are two types of elections that we really need to be aware of. And there's a few more, but bear with me. There's like what? There's you get the primary, you have the runoff, you have constitutional, and then you have the general election. So you have about basically four types of elections. Okay, the first one we're going to be talking about here is the primary. A primary election is an election in which voters decide which candidates will represent that party in the general election. So I really like to use, even though I'm not a sports fan, and I'm not, but I like to use football as an analogy here. If you are familiar with the NFL, and if you're familiar with the Super Bowl, this terminology should sound familiar. Well, we have two separate conferences. We have and I really can't remember. I want to say it's the National Football. You know what? I'm not. I do not remember what NFC and AFC stands for. Conference. That's National Football Conference and American Football Conference, if I'm remembering that right. Let me know. Let me know if I do get that right. But anyways, you have these two separate conferences. We can name these two separate parties, right? Well, in the general election is your playoffs, right? Because within the conference, you have this competition to figure out which team is going to represent that particular conference, right? And then after you have those competitions, you then have the Super Bowl, where it's the two conferences with one candidate now from one team from each conference is now going to compete against the other to determine who's the best team out of both conferences, and then that's the winner of the Super Bowl. Well, the playoffs is the primary election. The primary election is when the political parties get to choose. They window down the candidates down to one to represent the entire party in that particular race. So we saw in the 2016 presidential election a host of Republicans running in the primary for the presidential nomination. Ultimately, we know that President Trump won that nomination. Fast forward to 2020, when we had the Democrat primary. We saw a host of Democrat candidates running for that nomination. Ultimately, we know that President Biden won that nomination. But the point I'm trying to get at is that they went through the Republican Party in 2016 had, 12 candidates? I can't remember the exact number, but there was a host of them. Democrats, same thing in 2020. They had a host. I want to say it was around 16, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. Candidates running for this nomination. I could be off with that number. I can't remember the exact, but you get what I'm saying. There was a lot, okay? And the primary is this process for which the parties elect out of all those who's going to be the nominee to represent that party. So I like using the NFC and the AFC as an analogy to the primary to help us understand what the primary election is. Okay. Within primaries, we have different types of primaries. Okay. We have the closed primary election, in which this is an election in which only voters registered with the party may vote for that party's candidates. So closed primary states include Delaware, Maryland, New York, Florida, Nevada, Oregon, Kentucky, New Mexico, Pennsylvania. Open primary, on the other hand, is an election in which any registered voter may vote in any party's primary or caucus. Caucus is a gathering to determine a body, a group of people gathering for a political purpose to nominate a nominee. That's what a caucus is. So open primary states include Alabama, Michigan, Montana, Vermont, Arkansas, Minnesota, North Dakota, Virginia, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, Wisconsin, Hawaii, Missouri, and Texas. So those are for us in this class. Texas is an example of an open primary, because it doesn't matter what your what your party affiliation is. You can vote in any Democrat or Republican primary, assuming that you're in the right voting location, i.e., that you're voting in your precinct, that you're voting in where you are allowed to vote. But you do declare in the end when you choose the ballot, because you will be asked, do you want a Republican ballot or a Democrat ballot? When you are asked that, once you say, I would like a Republican ballot or I want a Democrat ballot, you make a declaration of a political party. So that's how you obtain here in Texas your party affiliation. You participate in a primary, which we have every 2 years. So every 2 years, you get to choose what your party affiliation is. Now note that that stipulation does not carry over into the general election. When you get into the general election, you can vote for Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. It doesn't matter. You can vote for any and all of them. You can vote for a mixture of both Democrats and Republicans. You can do that in the general election. But when you talk about the primary, when we talk about the party within that state, this trying to figure out who's going to represent that party in that particular election, you have to choose here in Texas which slate of candidates in that party you want to vote for, if that makes sense. Crossover voting, it happens when a person votes in the primary election for the party they do not normally support. So crossover voting. So hypothetically speaking, let's say that there is a candidate you want to win. Even though you don't typically vote for that party, you just really like that particular candidate. So you choose to switch parties to vote in that other primary to cast your vote for that particular candidate. Likewise, maybe there's a candidate you want to lose. Maybe there's not a candidate you want to win. Maybe there's just a candidate you want them to lose. So you drop out, you go into that party's primary to try to vote, you cast your vote against that particular candidate so that they are eliminated when it comes to the general election. Right? Voters, we are pretty strategic with our voting choices and how we vote. So crossover voting is that what we're talking about? Potentially there's a candidate I don't want them to win. So I might go vote in the primary, in that party's primary that I normally don't vote for, but I'm going to do that for this one election, right? There is absolutely, just to be clear, that's not an illegal thing to do. It's actually pretty strategic of us, right? But I digress. Again, just to say it, just to be clear, it's not illegal for crossover voting because you're voting in one election. You're voting in a primary. It's just maybe not the primary that you typically vote in, right? You're voting in this in that conference that you typically don't root for, but you're going to do it anyways as a way to be strategic with your voice. I digress. Runoff elections. I mentioned those earlier just a moment ago, and this is an election between two candidates who are two candidates receiving the most votes when neither received a majority of votes in the election. So if you have two candidates get 38% of the vote, you have a race that you have an election where there's four candidates. Two of them receive 38% of the vote, both. Well, you're going to have a runoff election between just those two candidates. Those who have the most, those who polled the most, not polled, but who received the most, who received the majority of the, not majority, that's not the one I'm looking for either, but who received the most votes. Let me put it that way. I'm digressing. Let's move on. So the general election is an election in which voters decide between party candidates that won the respective primary races. So this is the Super Bowl. Yes. The general election is typically held in November, okay, and this is where we have Republicans versus Democrats, right, and they're competing with one another. This is where you and I get to vote, and we can vote for Democrats and Republicans and for independents if we wanted to. We can mix up our vote however we want to. At this point, party affiliation doesn't mean anything in the ballot box. When we go to vote, when we cast our ballot, it doesn't matter. Now, typically, though, we're not going to, if if you're a Republican or if you're a Democrat, you're gonna hold true to that political party. You're most likely gonna vote for all Democrats or all Republicans, depending upon which political party you prescribe to. You can typically stick with that. But like I said earlier, we do see crossover voting occur, and you might actually like particular candidates from one party, but you like the other candidates from the other party for different races, for different elections. It can happen. I'm digressing. So the general election, this election is typically held in November. It's usually the first Tuesday of the month. The winner of this election is the new office holder. Whoever wins the general election, that is now the new office holder. Now, if it's the incumbent that wins, and we'll talk about the incumbent in just a moment, because I know it sounds a little confusing. What is an incumbent? We'll get to that. But just note that whoever wins the general election, they are the office holder now for that position. So if the one who was already in office lost, now we have a new office holder. If that office holder won the re-election, then they will continue on being that office holder. The general election dictates this. Like I said, I use the Super Bowl as an analogy. We have the playoffs, which are the primary elections, and then we have the Super Bowl, which is the general election. Okay, I just like using that analogy because I think it makes sense, right? It makes sense, at least, yeah. Anyways, so so there are other types of elections, right? We have this at-large elections, when voters choose a candidate to represent the entire jurisdiction, state, county, city, right? So think about some examples, right? I'll give you a moment here to think about some examples where the entire jurisdiction gets to choose a candidate. I'll give you a second here. And if you were thinking, well, Senator Cruz or Senator Cornyn of Texas, they are elected at the state level by the entire state. That is then a at-large election. You would be correct. Yes, absolutely. You're dead on. Absolutely, yes. So at-large elections, right, is where the entire jurisdiction gets to vote for them, right? So, like I said, city, state, like for senators, right? Other statewide candidates include the governor, lieutenant governor, comptroller, Texas Supreme Court justices, right? These are done at the state level where the entire state gets to vote for them, right? Versus district elections. This is a little different. Right? This is when voters choose a candidate to represent a district within the entire jurisdiction. So I'm going to pause again here and let you think about some examples that would fit this district elections definition here. Yeah. Yes, you are absolutely right. Right? Yeah. Congressional races. Texas House races, Texas senatorial races. Yes, these are examples of district elections. Why? Because we are congressional districts, pun intended, also referred to as CDs or congressional districts. These are districts that are drawn up within the state, right? So these are district elections. We choose within this particular district, out of the entire state, those of us who live in a particular district, we get to choose who will represent us in that district in the U.S. House of Representatives, or in the Texas House of Representatives, or in the U.S. Or the Texas Senate, for that matter. Right? So, yeah, just be mindful of that. So we're talking micro and macro here. Those who represent the entire jurisdiction, like a state, versus those who represent and those who we elect to represent a district, a portion of that jurisdiction, like a state. Let's move on. So we have some forms of democracy, or some democracy that I want to make sure that we're familiar with here real quick. We have the initiative. Right? This is a law or constitutional amendment proposed and passed by voters and is subject to review by the state courts. This is also called a proposition. Right? So yeah. So an amendment, maybe to the Texas Constitution. Maybe we want to see a school bond passed. Right? A referendum, on the other hand, is a yes or no, it's up and down vote by citizens on a law or candidate proposed by the state. So when we amend our Constitution, right? How we do it here, the Texas legislature meets and passes a amendment change, and then that amendment change gets sent to you and I through the ballot box. We get on our ballot, it would be placed this referendum. We get to say, yes, we support this amendment change, or no, we do not support this amendment change. Well, that's up to you and I. And that's where you and I get to have a direct say on what happens to our state constitution, right? Now, a recall, this is a removal of a politician. It's similar to impeachment, but it's not the process of going through the House and the Senate and involving like the U.S. Supreme Court. We don't have that here. This is what the removal of a politician or government official by the voters through an election. Okay, an example of this is the 2003 California governor's recall, when Governor Schwarzenegger was voted out or recalled. Now, I need to make this note here. Texas, we do not have a recall method. We do not have that here. We can remove elected officials. We can remove the governor if we want to through the impeachment process, but it's through the impeachment, right? So it's more involved. So there is a mechanism to remove those who are elected, and it's not during an election. If they've done something that's heinous, if they've done a crime that is warranted for impeachment, then that subjects them to the impeachment process. We have that mechanism, yes. But this ability to just recall a governor, like the Texas governor, just because we don't like the situation, or that he's done something, even though he was just reelected, he's done something that we just find egregious. We here in Texas, we do not have this recall method. I just want to point that out. So running for office, what is an incumbent and what is a challenger? I am so glad you asked this, because this is a term. These are two terms that get thrown around quite a bit during an election. So an incumbent is the current holder of the office, of the political office. So let's go to the 2020 presidential election, for example. President Trump was the incumbent because he was currently serving in that position. Joe Biden was the challenger, that is the person running against the current holder of that office position, right? So we can take this, we can go back to 2018 here in Texas, when was it 2018? Yeah, it was 2018. I had to remember that for a second. When Beto O'Rourke ran against Senator Cruz. Cruz was, in fact, the incumbent. Beto O'Rourke was the challenger. Right? So the incumbent is just a fancy term we like to use as a way to describe the current office holder. The challenger is the individual challenging the incumbent. So the incumbent, that is the current office holder, they have some advantages, right? I mean, they have some advantages at their disposal when they seek re-election. But, and it boils down to these 4 points. They have staff support. They have always been established as a senator or as a as this government official, right? We can use the 2018 Senate races here in Texas, the U.S. Senate races. Senator Cruz, right? He had staff support. He was well established. That was an advantage that he had. Visibility. Being a senator, being a current government office holder, you are seen through the, maybe you've been interviewed a bunch of times on the news. You've gotten your name out. Your name is out because you are one of the 50 senators. Right? So it's a matter of, you're very visible. You're seen by a lot of people if you are already the incumbent, right? Especially in that particular state, because since you represent, like, for example, going back to the example, since Senator Cruz represents the state, he can come back to the state, and we basically know who he is, basically. And just a small little caveat, real quick, just a little bit of information that's fun. I don't know if you actually know this, but Ted Cruz, his actual real name is Rafael Edward Cruz. Little tidbit of information there, which is a pretty awesome name. But I'm digressing. Campaign contributions. Listen, if you are a government official, right? If you are a U.S. senator, like going back to this example with Ted Cruz, if you are a senator, you have a track record. You have a voting record. Campaign contributions are easy from lobbying groups, because words are extremely cheap. Action, on the other hand, that's expensive. Here's what I mean. As a candidate, sure, you can promise me the moon and back, but are you actually going to do that? Right? You can say everything and anything under the sun to convince me that I should vote for you. Sure. But your words are cheap, right? It's your actions that determine that. With someone who's already an incumbent, they have a voting record. They have past actions that, as a lobbying group, I can go, that individual has supported this cause, my cause, and therefore, since he or she has done that faithfully, I'm going to continue supporting them. I'm going to give them campaign contributions. Likewise, right, as individual citizens like you and I, right, we may go, okay, you know what, they've done a good job. As a senator, you know what, as Ted Cruz, you've done a good job. I'm going to keep giving you. I'm going to contribute to your campaign. An incumbent has that track record, has that voting record that they can rely on. And this is a strong advantage that incumbents have, because they have proven what they will do. Does that make sense? And of course, fracking privileges. This is free use of mail, right? Incumbents like Senator Cruz here was able to put out mail-outs, letting everyone know what everything he's done since last time he was elected, right? So that's important for us to know. These strengthen how the incumbent is. The incumbent is very difficult to defeat because they're well established, they are well known, they have support of their staff. They're in Washington, in the home offices as well. They get campaign contributions. They're known within the state, and they get to use part of their office. They get free use of mail to send out flyers, to send out, hey, this is what I've been doing, right? So this is a huge advantage. These are huge advantages, right? Huge. Last little thing, then we're going to move on. But when it comes to the incumbent, we, as voters, we can go, okay, you know what? He or she has behaved in this way. I support that. I'm going to continue voting for them. Or being an incumbent can hurt you if there's some scandal or if there's something they've done that you and I, as voters, we don't like really do not like. Being the incumbent can hurt, but we often choose what we know versus what we don't know. As voters, we often tend to do that. But let's move on. So running for president, yes, we're here. Okay, so we got a lot of ground to talk about here. We got so much to talk about. Well, actually, I got ahead of myself. We got a little more to talk about here before we move to the president, before we move on to the Electoral College. My apologies. I'm just excited, y'all. I'm excited. I'm excited to talk about this stuff. I'm digressing. So, why do incumbents lose? Okay. Well, redistricting. This is a process for which the congressional maps, districts, are redrawn in a way that favor a particular party or a particular candidate, and that can an incumbent can be voted out if their district has changed so much. Scandals. If a candidate is known for a scandal or recently a scandal has occurred, this could hurt their chances to be re-elected. Right? I've already mentioned that. The coattail effect, the result when a popular presidential candidate helps candidates from his or her own party win their own elections. We've seen a lot of this throughout U.S. history, actually. This is not a new theme, by the way. This isn't. When you have a popular president, and a popular presidential candidate, for that matter, you will see that candidate going and helping Senate races, candidates in Senate races, candidates in House races. This happens, and it happens quite a bit, and this is called the coattail effect. Right? This, you're riding on the coattails of a popular president. The midterm election effect. This is where the president's party usually loses seats due to public opposition with their agenda the first 2 years in office. So the president, remember, they are up for re-election every 4 years, right? Every 4 years. And in the midterm, right, it's after the first 2 years, the president has the ability to establish the agenda, and we get to react to it. Do we like it? Do we not like it? And typically, historically speaking, this isn't new. This is not a new trend. Historically speaking, the incumbents, whatever political party is the incumbent, they will lose seats in the House or in the Senate. Why? Because that's us reacting to that particular president at that time. Right? So the midterm election effect is where the president's party usually loses seats, whether it's in the House, whether it's in the Senate, even potentially at the state level, right, with the Texas House, the Texas Senate. It's potential that we'll see the incumbent party just lose political power. And the reason for that, well, not the reason, but it's called the midterm election effect. Right. Now let's transition to voting behavior. Methods for evaluating a candidate. We have retrospective judgment. This is evaluating a candidate based on his or her past record and views on issues. We also have prospective judgment, where we are evaluating a candidate based on his or her current record and views on issues. So these are two different ways that you and I judge candidates, judge our elected officials, right? We can use what they've done in the past as a way to judge them, or we can take a look at what they're saying now. Forget what they've done. What are they saying now? Right? Two different methods for evaluating our candidates. Direct voting factors, right? Talking about voting behaviors. Political party affiliation has an impact on our voting behavior. right? We typically vote for our political party, whatever party affiliation that we have, whether we agree or support the Republican Party or the Democrat Party. We hold true to that, right? So that party ID can help explain voting behavior, right? Communication, physical presence, physical appearance. So how well a candidate communicates with you and I. How well do they communicate? What do they look like? And that seems a little silly. I need a note here. In the 1960 presidential debates, Richard Nixon, this was the first televised presidential debate. Okay, for those who watched it on TV, they would tell you that JFK, John F. Kennedy, he won the debate. But if you listen to it on the radio instead of watching it, people said that no, it was Richard Nixon that won the debate. Richard Nixon was actually sick with the flu during the 1960 presidential debate. And that, so on camera he was sweating. He looked sick because he was sick. And this hurt, right? So just the physical appearance of an individual has an impact on which candidate we choose to vote for. Who knew? Also, I have to throw this little tidbit out there. I have to do this. My when I took government 2305, my government professor, he talked about this election, the 1960 presidential election, and he often said that JFK won because of his hair. He had good hair, which coincides with this idea that we take a look at physical attributes. We take a look at physical appearances of our candidates. It's interesting. Personal qualities, right? The character, honesty, I can't read now. Do they have integrity? These things matter to you and I. It's not just the physical appearance, what we look like, how tall, how short we are. Do we have nice hair or not? I don't. Do we have, does our candidate have facial hair or not? Or, do they dye their hair? Do they have earrings? It's more than just our physical appearance is what I'm getting at. Right? We look at character. We look at the level of honesty. We take a look at their integrity. For me, what I look for, and this doesn't tell you anything political about me. It doesn't. But what I look for in candidates are two main factors. Are they coherent? And can they articulate a position? Right? Can they articulate, can they communicate well and tell me what they want to do? If they can do that, that's a quality I'm looking for, right? And also we vote according to issues. Economy, healthcare, military, the pandemic, issues, abortion rights, pro-life, pro-choice, foreign policy issues. There are so many out there. That's the reason why I'm kind of struggling here. We judge them based on issues, right? I'm digressing. We got a lot more ground to cover, so we're going to keep going here. So now we're talking about the president. So the nomination process. This is January through mid-summer on a 4-year, of a presidential election, right? So we're going to be, So the goal is to win debates against other party candidates. This is the primary. In a state primary, most common, that is that most states use the primary election to select. The Republicans and Democrats use this primary system as a way to choose a candidate. Some states don't. They use the caucus. That is a group of people, like the Republican or Democrat Party will gather together as a group and choose a candidate like that, through that process, rather than having just an election that you and I are familiar with the primary. Most important at the start, so that is the reason why the Iowa caucus and a New Hampshire primary is so important. It creates momentum. That's why it's so important. It creates momentum. Who wins? Who loses? Who we're going to be talking about now? Do they have actual votes, right? They are the Ohio caucus and the New Hampshire primary are very important because it sets the stage for who will win. Now, it's not a guarantee, right? Because there are other states that have larger populations that can change who that winner is. Look no further than what happened in the 2020 Democrat primary. Right? Pete Buttigieg, he was doing well until southern states like Virginia and Georgia, until their votes were counted, and then the rest of the country voted, and then the nomination was clearly and swiftly won by President Biden. So the point I'm trying to get at here is that they set the stage because it sets the front line on. Delegates, state party members who are chosen to represent a particular candidate at the party's state or national level nominating convention. So this is okay. We got a lot to talk about here. So we're going to be diving more into this process when we talk about political parties. So I'm just going to put that pause here. Just note for right now, what you need to know are that delegates are party members who are chosen to represent a particular candidate at the party, state, or national level nominating convention. There are many. There are precinct convention, county convention, state convention, national convention. We're going to talk about delegates, okay? But we're going to be talking about it in another lecture. We have a caucus. This is a form of a candidate nomination that occurs in a town hall style format rather than a day-long election, usually reserved for presidential elections. So a caucus, like I said, is a gathering of people to determine who the nominee will be for the state. Okay. National party conventions. This is held between July and September. Okay, this is where the presidential nominee. So these conventions, Democrat and Republican, is held sometime between July and September. I need to make this note here real quick. Okay, presidential nomination is not over until that convention declares the victor. An example, the 2016 RNC and DNC conventions. Regardless of who won the majority of the primaries, regardless who won the caucuses and the primaries, it means absolutely, okay, it doesn't mean absolutely nothing, because it does set a clear, it sets the stage, right? Most of the time, the front runner for those elections will win the nomination, right? Whoever wins those primaries typically truly do win. However, both political parties have established rules within themselves that the victor is not, there is no victor, there is no candidate who's won the nomination until the national convention for that party says this is our nominee. Until that happens, it's up in the air. Or it can be up in the air, put it that way. The Electoral College. This is a constitutionally created group of individuals chosen by the states, and we're going to talk about that selection process when we talk about political parties, because they're involved here, with the responsibility of formally selecting the next U.S. president. Right? So there are some myths and debates surrounding the Electoral College, and we probably are familiar with it, right? That we do not have a direct vote, and that it's a old system. Right? Well, okay, so it is old because the framers of the Constitution did give it to us. But the idea here it's actually a representation of our, pun intended, of our form of government, right? You and I do not represent ourselves, meaning you and I do not go to Congress and talk about these issues and pass laws and sign laws and send these laws to the president. You and I do not do that. We elect someone to do that on our behalf. Likewise, the Electoral College operates the same way. You and I elect a slate of delegates that are chosen at the state party conventions for both political parties. You and I get to vote Democrat or Republican, right? And when we vote, whoever holds that majority, let's say we're talking about Texas, the Republicans have demonstrated that they have won presidential elections since about well, at least like the 2020 presidential election in previous elections. Right? I'm digressing. What I'm trying to get at here is that we elected the delegates of the Republican Party to represent you and I in the Electoral College to directly cast a vote for that particular presidential candidate from that party. Does that make sense? So if Texas went blue, we would say, okay, Democrats, get your slate of delegates, send them to the Capitol. They're going to be casting a vote directly for the president. If Texas went Republican, same thing. Hey, Republican Party, send your delegates to the state capitol so they can cast a vote directly for the president. You and I elect a delegate to directly vote for the president. That's what the Electoral College is. Let's move on. So the Electoral College is a winner-take-all system. All electoral votes for a state are given to the candidate who wins the most votes in the state. This method was a compromise, congressional selection, and direct popular vote. So it's a combination. It's a compromise between that. The number of electoral votes is 538. Okay, where do we get this number from? Well, we have a total of 535 House members. And we have 100 U.S. senators because each state gets 2 senators. And we have 2 D.C. electors. So we have a total of 538 Electoral College votes. And it's all determined based upon how much representation you have. So the bigger states you are, like California and Texas, the more electoral votes you will have because it's based upon representation. Except for Maine and Nebraska, candidate wins the entire slate of electors. It's a winner-takes-all system. Maine and Nebraska, they have a system where the Electoral College votes is split between the parties. But Texas, for us here, we have a winner-takes-all. And like I said, most states, other than these two, they have a winner-takes-all system. So the winner takes all the Electoral College votes. So election day is the first Tuesday in November. But candidate must receive a majority. That is 270. That is the magical number. You must receive 270 out of the 538 Electoral College votes to be elected president. If you get more, that's awesome. But you have to get at least, bare minimum, 270. Mid-December, electors meet in the state capitol to vote for the president and vice president directly. Again, we elect delegates to go to the state capitol to vote directly for that presidential candidate and vice presidential candidate. Electors, usually long-serving volunteers, are selected during the state party convention. We will dive more deeper into this particular process when we talk about political parties. So just hang on. Just note right now that these electors, they're selected at the state party's convention. I'm going fast because we got a little more we got to get through. So hang on with me. So the what ifs. If no presidential candidate wins a majority of the electoral votes, the U.S. House then will choose among the top 3 candidates, with each state getting 1 vote. Elections, this has been done. We've actually had to use this process in elections of 1800 and 1824. If no vice presidential candidate wins a majority of the electoral votes, then the U.S. Senate chooses. Look no further than the election of 1836. makes me wonder what was going on in the 1800s. So criticisms of the Electoral College, right? The popular vote winner will not be elected. Sometimes whoever wins the most, who receives the most popular vote, may not win the actual Electoral College. So this is a criticism of it. Some would argue that it's undemocratic because we are choosing, we are electing a delegation to vote directly for us, rather than it's you and I having a direct vote on it. Does that make sense? We're electing delegates rather than we're electing directly. So that's a criticism. It's a winner takes all approach, cancels the votes of losing candidates in each state, and electors can change votes. Although I can attest to this, Electoral College delegates, they, especially here in Texas, they sign an affidavit swearing under the penalty of law that they will vote according to that party. So whoever the nominee is for the Republican Party, those Republican delegates to the Electoral College at the state capitol will vote for whoever is that Republican nominee who actually won the election, right? Who won the primary and who won the general election for that state. Some states have laws requiring electors to cast their vote for the popular vote winner. This is a criticism as well. So it's actually built into law that you have to vote, that you must. In some states, not here in Texas, but some states have this. More than 99% of electors have voted for the popular vote winner. That's an interesting statistic. So just make these notes, right? These are criticisms. Continuing on, it gives an advantage to the most populous states because they have the most electoral votes. Those who have the most population, those who have more representation in the U.S. House of Representatives, they have more electoral votes. We here in Texas, if I remember, we have about 38 electoral college votes, 38, 39, compared to like Rhode Island, which has like what, 3? So it's interesting. That is a criticism. Some small states are overrepresented since all are entitled to at least 3 electoral college votes. It can lower voter turnout in certain states or areas within a state that are dominated by a single political party. Example: Texas Republicans, and for California, it's the Democrat Party. So we have less competition. This is a criticism. But there are some benefits that we should note about the Electoral College. It requires candidates to appeal to smaller states. It requires candidates to appeal to everyone. Not just large populations to get elected, or these large states, but also to the smaller states. It demonstrates a clear political victory due to the Electoral College margin being greater than the popular vote margin. And also the United States has a stable democracy that should not be changed. So why change the Electoral College? Why get rid of the Electoral College? It has worked thus far. So this is a benefit. It has established a well-governed democratic republic that is stable. So why change it? But that's a benefit. That's the argument against changing Electoral College. So let me ask you, where do you stand? Electoral College, should we modify it? Should we get rid of it? Or since we've been stable, keep it as is? What do you think? Let me know. It's interesting, right? With that said, if I've said anything that you have a question about or comment about or a concern, please feel free to email me. But until next video, see you next time. Peace.